If you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you've probably realized that I'm a very curious person. I'm interested in so many different things, particularly the complexity and puzzles of life. But one area that, for whatever reason, doesn't capture my attention very often is death and dying and the afterlife and what all of that means. And this year, that has really changed. 2020, obviously with the coronavirus, there has been death and loss at a scale that I've never experienced in my life. As I'm recording here, there's 1.4 million deaths around the world. By the time you listen to this, it'll probably be approaching 2 million deaths. So millions of people will pass as a result of the coronavirus in a very short period of time. If you look at the demographics of those people, they are the wisdom class of our society, the older people over the age of 70, the grandmothers and grandfathers, the great-great-grandfathers and great-great-grandmothers. These are the people who have an enormous amount of knowledge and maturity, and now they're gone. What do we do with that? How do we think about that? How do we mourn that loss? How do we learn from that experience? I don't even begin to have answers to those questions, but I have a lot of questions, and hopefully my guest on this week's show can give us a little bit of a blueprint, a roadmap in terms of moving forward. If you're new here, it's the Lucas Rockwood Show. I'm a yoga teacher, a trainer, I'm a serial entrepreneur, I'm the father of 3 kids, but first and foremost, I'm a student. I like to learn things. So go out into the world and I find therapists and medical doctors and meditation teachers and nutritional coaches, try to bring their best work here so we can all learn from them and hopefully live more fulfilled lives. Let's see how it goes. If you like this show, I'd ask you to sponsor the show, and here's how you do it. You don't have to give any money, you don't have to do anything, but share the show. It really helps me. Share it out on social, and by helps me, I mean it helps my ego. I feel good when more people listen to the show. You can tag me on social media. It's at Lucas Rockwood. If you have questions for the show, you can DM me also on social media. It's at Lucas Rockwood on Instagram. And last but not least, if you're listening on your phone, I would very much appreciate it if you just scroll down and leave a rating and review. Again, it just helps more people find the show, and for all the obvious reasons, that makes me feel good. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called Thoughts on the End of Life, and I am joined here with Charles Garfield. Charles is a psychologist, a professor, and a lecturer. He's the author of 13 books, including Our Wisdom Year and Life's Last Gift. He's been recognized internationally as the founder of the Shanti Project, which is a widely acclaimed AIDS and cancer service organization. It's shanti.org, and you can learn more about all of his work and his books at his website, charlesgarfield.com. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So a huge portion of your life's work has been around illness prevention, death, and dying. I'm curious, how did this interest come from a personal experience, or has it just always been a part of life that you've been focused on?
I went through a wonderful graduate program in clinical psychology, and I really wanted to use those skills as a psychologist to benefit people. And the thing that really moved me the most were people who are really struggling, who are really up against it. And the group that really met that criteria best were people who were dealing with some life-threatening challenge. And I was fortunate enough to get a position at the Cancer Research Institute at the University of California. And I was able to use those skills that I had learned as a psychologist to support people who are really struggling.
And for people listening, tell us a little bit about the Shanti Project, the work that you've done over the years. I know that it's been focused on AIDS and cancer, and I imagine there's been quite a bit of shift. I mean, obviously, in both of those diseases, there's been quite a bit of progress over the years.
Absolutely. And there's also Shanti has a program now that's dealing with people who have COVID-19, the new illness that's threatening all of us.
Yeah.
So we're moving into that support situation as well. Shanti Project started as a volunteer program. I needed help at the Cancer Institute. There were just too many people to take care of. And I decided that if I could select volunteers, train them, match them with patients, I'd get some support. I'd get some help myself in meeting the needs of all sorts of people. And it was an idea. It was the first time anybody really tried to train volunteers in counseling skills, in the real counseling skills that are necessary to take care of people. there were volunteer programs before that, but not trained as conscientiously as we do at Shanti Project.
Yeah.
And it worked. It's 46 years old now, and it's still going strong.
So, this part of life, death and dying and hospice, it's obviously so important. I mean, it's on all of our minds all the time, and yet it's not very well discussed. It's not, like in my family, I haven't spoken to my parents about this. I really should. Why do you think we shy away from such an obvious milestone in life? Why are we so uncomfortable, unwilling, unready? And I include myself in that category to really go there.
Well, I'll tell you, the quick and easy answer is we're afraid.
Yeah.
It's threatening. It's a threatening conversation, and it seems like it's hard to have. But another reason is that we don't have the basic information on how to have the conversation, how to have these kinds of conversations in a way that's supportive for all concerned, for everybody, for the older person, for the younger person. And the reason I wrote the books that I have, especially the new book, it's called Our Wisdom Years, is to teach people how to have conversations in difficult situations.
Yeah. So let me ask you about this. I know you have this concept, the heroic mode, that sometimes people switch into when a family member's in facing a terminal illness or facing a very grave illness and we don't know the outcome. Can you talk a little bit about why that might not be the best approach, the heroic mode, meaning the problem solver, the ultimate, solution-oriented person?
Well, it's really a simple answer, although it's sometimes very hard to do. We want to do something. We want to change it. Ultimately, we really want to cure the person. We want to make the illness go away. And so we search and we try and we look for more doctors and we look for more treatments. And we work as hard as we possibly can. But what we miss is the contact with the individual. If you ask the person, the older person, if we're talking about people in their wisdom years, if we talk about people who are ill, it's the same story. What they want is us to be there for them. They want a compassionate presence. They don't want you to run around and try to find magic cures that will never come.
Right. I'm curious, with your end-of-life work, with your work around the very, very ill, terminally ill, what do you find is are commonalities or consistencies in people in that part of life? Are there lots of regrets? Are there lots of families? What kinds of things maybe that people might not be aware of?
Well, the two words that come to mind, and your question's an excellent question. The two words that come to mind that I hear most often are regret and gratitude. People talk about the regrets that they've had and things that they wish they had done differently, and there are ways of working with regret. There are ways of dealing with regret so that people can lessen the burden. And then, of course, gratitude. We don't spend enough time thinking about what we're most grateful for in our lives. It may be a person, a relationship, somebody you love. It may be work that you're proud of, that makes a contribution, that feels like really good work. But what are we most grateful for, and what do we regret most that we can deal with?
And so as a psychologist and as someone who's spent so much time studying and working in this arena, let's imagine somebody is in the later chapter of their life and they have regret about a broken relationship. Let's imagine it's a sibling or a close relative who has been estranged. I imagine it's a relatively common story. You mentioned that you can work with regret. How might you help somebody think about it? Obviously, there's not one solution, but how might you help somebody think about that situation?
Well, we have a whole chapter on it in Our Wisdom Years in the book. Write a forgiveness letter to yourself. Write a forgiveness letter that includes the observation that you did the best you could, considering who you were at the time and what you knew at the time. You couldn't have done it any other way. What people torture themselves with too much is they forget who they were at the time they made the mistake, what feels like a mistake.
Yeah.
They think they should have done it the way they would do it now. But now you're more mature. Now you know more, hopefully. So write yourself a forgiveness letter, or write a forgiveness letter to somebody who did something to you that you feel bad about, and lay the burden down. Right? You may not even send the letter. but it's called externalization. Just externalize it. Get it down on a piece of paper. Write in the letter what you've learned from what you regret that you'll never do again. Allow yourself to feel the gratitude that comes from letting go of all of the self-blame, and learn to be a better person as a result of the lessons you learned from laying that burden of regret down.
This is a bit of a question that maybe doesn't have an answer, but when you think of this, forgiveness letter and forgiveness in general, let's imagine you're forgiving yourself, or let's imagine you're forgiving someone who has objectively wronged you. Where do you think that forgiveness is going? Is that you making peace with the world, you making peace with yourself, you throwing this trauma out into the universe? I don't know if there's an answer to this, but sometimes I think about, who is this? What's happening when I forgive somebody? Is that me bearing it for myself? Is that me releasing it for myself? How do you think about what's happening to, I guess, what might be described as stored trauma or stored memory or stored pain?
That's a wonderful question. I think the answer to it, at least one answer to it that I think is important, is that we learn from it. What happens to it is we don't forget. We may forgive, but we don't forget. And it becomes part of who we are. It becomes part of our maturation, part of our growth, part of our development. We learn from it, and we move on, and we hopefully become a better person as a consequence. So again, I don't know about going into the universe, but it does go into our own hearts and minds, and it enables us to grow.
So we're living in a challenging time right now where, COVID has hit. I'm here in Spain, and we got hit pretty hard. And the U.S., of course, is getting hit even harder. But everyone I know is 1 degree of separation from an immediate COVID death. And I would guess here within a couple of months, pretty much everybody in the world will probably be maximum 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And so that's a lot of grief and a lot of loss in a very compressed period of time. Of course, there's always the cycle of life, but it's pretty compressed. The pace and the timing of that's pretty rapid. And I'm curious, as someone like yourself who spent so much time in this world already with death and dying and illness, how are you thinking about that acceleration and the impact that is having or will having, or do you think it isn't so noteworthy?
No, I think it's very noteworthy. I think because of the catastrophe that we're facing, and because of all the death that's happened, but all the death that will happen in the time ahead, I think one of the things that's happening is it's forcing us individually and collectively to look at who we are, what we do, how we live our lives, what our values are. It's initiated a kind of reflection, both on the individual level and on the societal level, a kind of reflection in the hearts and minds of many people about whether or not the way we live our lives makes sense. What do we want to preserve? What do we want to let go of? I think of it as letting go, letting in, and letting be. What do we want to hold on to that we find is the best in ourselves? But what has gotten us into trouble in the past? It's a time because we're forced to shelter in place, many of us, and we're staying home a lot. It's a time for reflection, and many people are talking to me about that.
I'm curious your thoughts. I'm sure that you've been part of many passings, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on funerals, their importance, their lack of importance, or whether it's individual. And I ask this as a really fortunate individual. I'm in my 40s, and I've only had a handful of losses, significant losses in my life. And of course that will change. That changes for everybody. And some of the funerals I've chosen to go to, some of them I've opted out of. And I don't know if it's my better self opting out. I don't know if it's my smaller self. I go back and forth. Are funerals for the living? Are they for the dead? And obviously that's a different question for different people and different beliefs. But when you look at it from a psychological standpoint, a healing and a whole person perspective, how do you think about end of life, celebration of life, funeral celebrations?
I think they're both for the living and for the dead. I think it's a way of honoring the dead. I think a lot of the eulogies that people really work hard at where they develop something that really is a gift to the people who are present. The eulogy can be, I've done a number of eulogies in my life, including for my parents, and although it was difficult, those are challenging things, it was a way of honoring them that I really wanted to do. It was a way of getting what I call honorable closure on the situation. It's also for the living. Funeral for the living, it's a way of saying goodbye. It's a way of remembering how do you want to hold this person in your heart for the duration as you walk in the world for them. In what ways might you walk in the world? What I mean by that is, ask yourself, what did I learn from this person? What values were important to them? What ideas were important to them? How might I incorporate those into myself? And that's the kind of reflection that people do at funerals, where they really are paying attention, not just showing up and hanging out for a while, but really paying attention to the meaning of the ritual. It allows us an opportunity to internalize, to bring inside ourselves the goodness, the good parts of that person, and to learn from them and to incorporate them into our own being.
You use the term closure. What have you seen and experienced with your work about people who've done closure well and people who haven't done closure well? And I'll frame the question again just with a preface that I've been quite fortunate not to have had major losses yet at this point in my life, but a number of people very close to me have. And I have known people who very conspicuously and deliberately put off mourning for many, many years. And again, I don't feel like I'm in any kind of position to judge. But again, from a psychological standpoint and from someone who just has a lot of experience with this stage of life, how do you think about that in terms of just self-regulation, self-management, emotional health?
How do I think about closure?
How do you think about the importance of closure and the relatively frequent practice of postponing grieving, postponing mourning, and putting things off, burying yourself in your work, and saving the tears for another day, which for whatever reason a number of people in my life have done with major losses in their life?
I've seen people who had tried to deny them the importance of mourning, deny the importance of grief, and it stays alive in their hearts and minds, sometimes for decades. There's no resolution. I think the important thing is to do the reflection, to allow the grieving, to not be afraid of the raw pain that sometimes comes. I think of it, I think of grief and what people are afraid of in these situations as the excruciating presence of an absence. If you've gone through a death of somebody close, you know that it feels like a hole in your chest. It feels awful. But if you try to deny it, it'll remain. It stays alive. It stays psychologically alive. The important thing is honor the person and the transition, the death. Honor that person by as I said earlier, internalizing what you can learn from them. Allow yourself to feel the grief. There tend to be 3 stages in the grief process, and very briefly they are the shock and denial, the first one, and then the second is the raw pain of it all. You realize, my God, it really did happen. She's not here anymore, or he's not here anymore. And then third is reintegration. You go back into the world, hopefully having learned from the situation. I talk about that in Our Wisdom Years in the book, and I think it's important to understand that you don't get away scot-free by trying to deny the grief. It'll stay alive and cause more problems later on.
From an evolutionary perspective, it's pretty easy to justify lots of human behavior. It's, self-preservation, procreation. But if you look at humans as just an animal, which of course is reductionist, but let's say we're just an animal, what role does grief play? It's such an pain and loss. It's just such a big part of life, and from an evolutionary standpoint, I really have a hard time figuring out what it's there for.
What grief is there for?
Yeah.
it teaches us about love. Grief teaches us about who we care about most, what it feels like to lose somebody who you really love a great deal, and what the centrality, the central nature of love really is in our lives. You wouldn't feel the grief if you didn't feel the love, if you didn't care so much. There wouldn't be any such thing as grief. But by trying to minimize the impact of the grief, we lose the opportunity to recognize the importance of the love. And that's as critical an element in the grieving process as anything.
Almost like a reminder of our humanity, or like a forcing factor for self-evaluation.
Exactly. But the self-evaluation is frequently around the issue of close relationship. Who do I really care about? What does it feel like to really love another person and then to lose them? Grief brings up all of that. If you somehow try to wall it off, you lose the opportunity to learn the lessons.
We have people listening who no doubt have been part of virtual funerals, Zoom funerals, watching their loved ones die on an iPad from an ICU. And unfortunately, this is happening now every day. And it's easy to, I guess rather than ask a direct question, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that type of passing, and how can people perhaps reframe that so it's not a double loss, no loved one and no funeral? How are you thinking about these very unusual, very challenging passings that are happening right now?
It's, again, another very good question. I wish they weren't happening. There's something to be said, something important to be said for the in-person situation, the funeral the way we used to know funerals. There's something to be said for the intimacy of it, the personal nature of it, the closeness of it. But I think we can make use of the current situation, whether there's a virtual funeral or whether there's the reflection about the person who died. I think we can write about it. I think if you keep a journal, to write in your journal, to write it out anywhere, your feelings about the person, what are you most grateful for that you learned from that individual? What are the most important things that you remember from your life together, or your memories of them? I think you can personalize the funeral by making it something that you grow from. That, usually the old style funeral, you go to the funeral, you have some feelings about it, maybe a lot of feelings about it, but then you go on with your life, except if you're the very close person, in which case it stays with you a lot longer and it's a lot more intense. But for most people who attend a funeral, you have some feelings and then you go on with your day. You go on with your life. I think we can make better use of the impact of the loss of a human being by doing some writing about what this person meant to you, what you regret not having done with the person, what you're most grateful for with the person, what you want to pass on to the younger folks that you learned from that person. There are ways of reflecting on the life of the person who died and your relationship with them that can be very useful and very important in your own development.
Your book is titled Our Wisdom Years, and I'm curious, right now we have this very, for me, really disturbing thing happening where it just seems very ageist. There's a very popular belief right now that COVID is an elderly condition. It's only something older people should be concerned about, and therefore we shouldn't be so concerned. And it's just really troubling to think of one chapter of life as disposable and another as more valuable, and yet there always seems to be this overvaluation of youth and undervaluation of age. And yet if you look at the population of the world, it's radically, at least of developed countries, it's radically skewing older and older every year, and people are older and healthier and cognitively sharp and truly, as to use your word, they're truly wise. I feel like it's a mistake. What are your thoughts?
it's definitely a mistake. You take a look at some cultures that have revered their older people.
Yeah.
But those were they were the wisdom keepers. They were the source of wisdom. No, I think we make a mistake when we idealize the young and minimize the importance of older people. The amazing thing is that the fastest growing segment of the population are centenarians, people over 100.
Yeah.
And in fact, what I write about in Our Wisdom Years is that there's a whole new stage of life after adulthood. It's not adulthood until you die. It's adulthood until about 60 or so, late 50s, early 60s in there, a little bit different for different people. But there's a whole new stage that happens after adulthood that I call Our Wisdom Years. That's why I call the book that.
Yeah.
And that new stage of development has a whole host of possibilities and potentials that are different than adulthood.
Yeah.
That's what gets me excited.
Yeah, I have no idea, I'm in my mid-40s, I have no idea what that chapter of life is like, but I know that this current chapter of my life is overwhelmed with thoughts of career and family to the point where there really isn't much space for much else. And I don't, of course I'm doing things wrong, but I think this is pretty typical of this chapter of my life. And there will come a time when my children are grown, and there will come a time when my career is secondary. And I would like to think that I'll have something interesting to say during that time. And I would very much like to think that I will be appreciated in society and not thought of as a second-class citizen. Well,
you're thinking about it very intelligently. I think the society is changing. I think because there are more and more and more older people, the baby boomer generation has become the older person generation. They've become the people living in their wisdom years.
Yeah.
I think what happens is don't get trapped by notions of retirement. The notion of retirement was developed by adults who never understood the potential of our wisdom years. Those years between 60 and however long you live, and it could be, as I said, since centenarians, the people over 100 are the fastest growing segment of the population. By the time you're 60, you could live another 40 years. This is not just about retirement and playing golf or going on vacation or watching movies. That's not what it's about. You can do all sorts of things that have to do with love and work. To relationships, connections with people, and work that you're proud of, not because you want to get ahead, not because you want to be successful, not because you want to make a lot of money, not because you're climbing the ladder. There's no more ladder to climb. That this is work that makes a difference. It may be volunteer work. It may be artistic creation. It may be whatever you care to have it be. But it's no longer the same motivation as it was during the adult years. It's very invigorating to think about our wisdom years, our later years in these terms.
Charles, I have one last question that I think about a lot, and that is how people live right now, particularly in the U.S., which is, as people get older, they tend to be pretty isolated. They tend to be pretty alone. I live in Barcelona, in the center of the city in Spain, and this morning I dropped my little boy off at his daycare, and on the way back home, there was a woman who is probably in her 80s crossing the street with a cane, and she needed help. And I helped her across the street, and it was very timely because we were having this discussion today. And I just thought, would this ever happen in the North American suburbs? Would a woman like that who is not related to me ever have contact with someone like me? Is there value in that? Is that more natural, less natural? Where I'm going with this is I worry about isolation and loneliness compounded with age, disease, and dying, and I am concerned that there's a weird trend in the past 30 years to isolate. Particularly parents are not with their children like they used to be, and here in Spain they still are. An elderly parent will often move in with their kids for the later part of their life, whereas that has largely disappeared from North America. And I'm curious about your thoughts about living arrangements.
Well, I think you point to an important issue. Loneliness can be a killer. it can be it can have very dangerous effects on people. People die of broken hearts because they're so lonely. But the good news is that there are new situations being developed, in part by social media, in part by groups that are forming of older people.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that we find in different parts of the U.S., for instance, is that there are more opportunities for older people at places like senior centers and collectives of various sorts that really address the issue of loneliness. It's a critical issue. You raise an important concern, and it's the kind of thing that we're just beginning to iron out. We're just beginning to get a handle on for our elders. What do they need in terms of relationship? How might we meet those needs? That's something that awaits our attention in the time ahead.
Charles, really enjoyed the conversation and connecting. For people listening, we'll send them to charlesgarfield.com. Is there another ask or another place that we should refer people to?
No, that's the best one right there, charlesgarfield.com, and the book is called Our Wisdom Years.
Very much appreciate your time, Charles. Wish you all the best, and let's keep in touch. Chronic lower back pain is estimated to affect as much as 80% of the population at some point in your life. It might happen when you're 25 and snowboarding. It might happen when you're 75 and just retiring from a career. But when back pain strikes, it can be really debilitating. There's lots of different things you can and should do to work on your spine strength and flexibility and balance. The fourth element that doesn't get talked about enough is traction. And traction is the practice of creating literally more space between your vertebrae. You can do this by lying flat, not so practical. You can do this by hanging upside down, like on old school inversion tables or gravity boots. And we've been doing it recently, well, for the past 10, 11 years, using the yoga trapeze. You hang from your hips and you hang upside down. And it's been so successful, so popular, that we have yoga trapeze teachers now in 38 or 39 different countries. We have yoga trapeze students in even more countries, 43 countries or something like that. And we are training teachers actively to work with students all around the world. You can teach private one-on-one. You can teach in gyms and fitness centers. A lot of our trainers now work virtually. They work via Zoom to help clients specifically with their spine. This course is 12 days long. It's live, it's interactive, it's a lot of fun. We walk you through the safety, the setup, the anatomy, the physiology, and all of the business concerns you need as well to get started teaching professionally right away. Whether you're a yoga teacher now or if you're new to teaching, the program will take you all the way from zero all the way to getting your very first client. To learn more about the program, go to yogatrapezeonline.com, yogatrapezeonline.com, and I hope you can join us. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a question from Kelly on Instagram. Kelly says, Lucas, I'm having some kind of weird allergic reaction to something that I'm eating, but I can't figure out what it is. I have two specific symptoms. One is gas and bloating. Sorry if it's too much information. And the other one is almost like a rash on the side of my neck. Do you have any ideas? So those two reactions that you're having are really common for a food allergy, but it could also be common for some other type of allergic reaction too, to something chemical in your house. It's really hard to figure this stuff out, but what I always try to do when something like this happens is really try to figure out when it started and then think about what changed in your life or your house. Like, did you start buying produce from a new place? Did you start cooking in a different way? Did you buy a new type of fabric softener? Did you move into a new place? Anything that you can figure out. And if you really can't figure out anything that has changed, you probably need to experiment with an elimination diet. What people want to do right away is go get allergy tested at the doctor, and I wish that was more accurate than it is. Unfortunately, you'll come back with results that might be useless, might tell you that you're allergic to strawberries and you're not. It's very hard to test for food allergies, and it's very often a moving target. The top food allergies are often things like milk and corn and soy and wheat. It's eggs. It's some of the most common foods on the planet, so it's really, really hard to know what it is. But the way that you try to figure out what it is you do an elimination diet. And I would start off with those top 10 foods because they very often are the culprit. And so let's imagine that you suspected a dairy allergy. You would get rid of anything that had dairy in your diet, and usually people will do it for 10 days. Then you reintroduce and you do like a mega dose. So let's say you got rid of milk. Let's say you're a coffee drinker with milk every morning and you also like yogurt, whatever it is. You get rid of dairy for 10 days. And then on day number 11, you basically just eat, milky coffee and yogurt all day and see what happens. See if you can feel something. Then you might move on to wheat. You might then move on to eggs. You might try fermented foods. You might take a look at soy. You might take a look at corn. You might take a look at shellfish. These most common, with the exception of shellfish, these most common allergens are often the culprit. And unfortunately, you can rarely get answers from an alternative or a mainstream doctor. You have to do a little bit of investigative research. Those symptoms that you're saying, though, are very common to some kind of allergic reaction. And the fact that you suspect it's food, usually your intuition is right, but it could also be something else. It could be something else that's going on, a new nutritional supplement, a new skincare product, just take a look and try to figure out something that's changed. If you learn something, share it with us. I'd love to learn what you discover. Good luck. Charles on Instagram says, Lucas, I'm trying to find the perfect home workstation for my back, and I'm experimenting with different chairs. I just got a kneeling chair, and I can't figure out if it's good for my back or bad for my back. I know I should know intuitively, but somehow I don't know. What do you think about kneeling chairs specifically? So there's lots of different setups that people will use in their offices and their workstations. Everything from a standing desk to a bar stool to a normal office chair to exercise balls to kneeling desks or a kneeling chair is what this listener is using. What do I think about them? I think whatever works for you. I think it's really helpful to have a variety of different things to play around with. I work at a standing desk as much as 12 or even 14 hours a day. Sometimes I'm on my feet all day long. That transition was very uncomfortable and very painful. A lot of people don't make it. The first months are just really awkward, mentally and physically, trying to figure out what to do with yourself. But even now, I'm here in my yoga studio, for example. I still have a variety of things around. So I have blocks, and sometimes I'll grab my laptop and sit on the floor. I have a low coffee table and some wicker stools. Sometimes I'll sit on those. I have a high bar stool, which occasionally I'll sit on. I do spend most of my time standing, but even when I'm standing, I have a little balancing block that I fidget with my feet. And it's nothing more than really like a yoga block type thing that I balance on. Your body likes to fidget. It likes to move. So if a kneeling desk works for you, I think that's great. I think it's pretty unlikely that's going to work for you for a 6 or an 8 hour day, to be honest. Some of my team members have kneeling chairs, but they also rotate. They'll do the kneeling chair for an hour and then switch to something else. And I think in many cases that variety of movement patterns throughout the day is more mimicking what we would move like in real life. So if it works for you, I think it's great. I would hesitate to recommend you sitting in that shape, that specific shape, for 6 or 8 hours a day, in the same way that I'd hesitate from sitting in any shape for 6 to 8 hours a day. Let us know how it goes. Thanks for listening to The Lucas Rockwood Show. If you enjoy the podcast, I have 2 asks of you. Number 1, share the show on social media with your friends and tag me. My handle is @LucasRockwood. Number 2 is please leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on. And last but not least, before you go, if you'd like to be on my mailing list, every week I send out information about the podcast, behind the scenes stuff, announcements of online classes and special events. I email about once a week. You can do that at yogabody.com/sign me up. And right now we have a free breathing worksheet on that page as well. It's yogabody.com/sign me up. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.